Hi everyone, this lecture is going to be on the principles of assessment, prescription, and exercise program adherence. So let's first start off with some of the recommendations in regards to which order you should be doing your assessments. So NSCA and ACSM has a slightly different order in which they recommend you do assessments. So if you notice, NSCA and ACSM, while they both start with resting assessments, they end a little bit different, right? So NSCA starts with resting assessments, but their last thing is cardiovascular. Whereas ACSM, it starts with resting assessments, but then their second thing is cardiovascular. And these orders kind of make sense, right? We know that we want to always start with resting assessments because those include blood pressure and heart rate, which we know are going to be dependent on things like our cardiovascular work output, right? So if we have them do a 6-minute walk test, that's going to influence their resting measurements. So it's really important that we do those resting assessments first and then go into these other components. And whether you choose to follow the NSCA recommended or ACSM recommended order is really kind of up to you and the facility that you're working with. What you kind of might note is that when you just did assessments with LifeFit, that kind of follows the order of ACSM. Okay, so you did your blood pressures, your height, and your weight. Then you actually did your balance and stability work. Then you went to cardiovascular, muscular strength, muscular endurance, and then flexibility. So important to remember these. There's a rhyme and reason for why we do it in this order. So now I want you to think about what are some of the responsibilities that you have as a certified fitness professional. Okay, and hopefully some of the things that you're thinking include education, knowing what is the most up-to-date information, the do's and don'ts for physical activity. You should know how to screen someone, and then based on that screening, selecting, administering, and interpreting that information so that you can create a program that is individually designed. You also want to be able to, that once you have that designed program, you can actually lead it and be able to critique people based on their movement patterns. And then probably one of the most important things is simply being able to motivate individuals. But you can see how all of these responsibilities kind of build up on one another. And while it's important to have these individual responsibilities, it's equally important to be able to use them together. So now let's go into some basic program design. So once you have a client and you want to put together a program, what are those concepts that you need to think through? Hopefully these are a review. So one of the things is specificity. Depending on what your client's goals are, you want to make sure that you're creating a program that is specific to those goals. So for instance, if you have a client who is going to be competing in a powerlifting competition sometime soon, you're going to want to make sure that you have some push and pull movements in your training. Okay, overload is this idea that we want to increase our workload and so that they can make gains, but it has to be at a way that doesn't increase the risk of injury, right? So you want to make sure that there's time for rest and recovery as well. Progression is also important, and you're going to learn more about progression and periodization, and it essentially means that we want to have gradual systematic work that's purposeful. We want to always know our initial values, and that comes into play when we do our assessment so that we can see change. Individuality essentially means that we're making it for them, right? And that's very kind of similar to specificity, but it's just individual that person's personality, their behaviors, not just their goals. Diminishing returns essentially means that the closer you get to your goal, the harder it is to be able to see changes, and that all makes sense, right? So if someone's getting closer and closer to their weight loss goal, losing those last 5 to 10 pounds can be much more difficult than losing the first 30 or 40. So you have to change the way in which you're designing your program for someone so that they continue to see those changes. And then the idea of reversibility is essentially that, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And our bodies have a really great capability of being able to just totally go back to their starting values. And so it takes work to maintain a physical fitness level. And so that's why it's really important that, again, if you don't use it, you lose it, and you kind of instill that into your client. So now let's think about how you'd actually put pen to paper and create a program design. In order to do this individualized, you want to kind of remember this acronym, and it's FIT: frequency, intensity, time, and type. And again, I hope that's a review for you. Frequency is just how many sessions, right? How often are you doing it? Intensity can be either percent 1RM if you're thinking about resistance training, or even percent VO2 or percent effort, right? So it depends on if you're doing cardiovascular or resistance training. Duration is how long you're doing it. Time. Mode is the type. So for cardiovascular training, this could be swimming, it could be elliptical, it could be biking, it could be running, Or for resistance training, it could be pin select, it could be circuit training, it could be more power training. So it depends on what you're programming. And then rate of progression is actually something we're going to get into next. And there are different stages of progression. Not all your clients will start at the initial stage and then move up to improvement and maintenance. Certainly some of your clients might start at improvement, or some of your clients might already be in maintenance. So it's important to understand where your clients are in their stage of progression. And your initial conditioning clients, those are going to be the ones who are very under-conditioned, right? But the nice thing is they're going to see some changes pretty quickly. And that's usually within that 4 weeks. It takes some familiarization. They're going to be a little uncomfortable. There's going to be more barriers. So just recognize that. And when you are increasing some sort of effort, do so in duration, right? Out of those FIT principles, make sure that the very first thing that you do increase is duration. Then go into improvement. And that's those individuals that's like 4 to 8 months later, they're starting to really get into it. They understand the movements. They understand why they're doing what they're doing. They can see the connection between your prescription and their goals, and they start to see progress faster. And then hopefully your clients get into maintenance. And this can be, almost later, the latter part of a year, so the 8th or 9th month. And these are those individuals that start to realize that they're doing this for life, right? They're training for life. This is really important where you start to add variety so that people don't get bored, and then they want to continue to stay in your program. This is a nice schematic for you to follow, and it basically just shows you that from session 1 all the way up to week 3 or even later, how you can take all the different assessments that we want to do with our clients and kind of disperse them throughout that time period. So if you remember, one of the first things we discussed during that pre-participation lecture is that it's a lot for them to do. The paperwork alone can take 20 to 30 minutes for them to fill out, let alone all the other actual physical assessments that we want to do. So if you can kind of follow this flow chart, you can see that in that first session, it doesn't necessarily have to be a training session, but that first session, you can look at your resting measures, you can do the health risk appraisal, potentially even look at if they need clearance, maybe do a posture assessment. You can also potentially do flexibility here, any movement screens. Then in week 1, you can potentially, if they want to look at balance, you can do balance or core functioning. Then in week 2, you can go and do some of that kind of traditional assessments. So flexibility, body composition, aerobic capacity. Then in week 3, you can do muscular endurance and muscular strength. And then potentially, if they are interested in more kind of athletic power drills, you can look at some of those assessments as well later on. And the key here is that what you can see is it's a nice way of taking those assessments and dispersing them throughout about a 3 to 4 week period so that you're not overwhelming your client. This is the ACE IFT model. And I'm not sure how much you've been exposed to this in the past, but this is a really nice model that demonstrates whether you're working with someone from a cardiovascular perspective or resistance training and functional movement, that there's kind of these 4 phases of which our clients can belong, and that's important for us to be able to recognize where they are in this phase. So are they in phase 2 or phase 1? And then how we can progress for them from phase 1 to phase 4. There is a document on Beachboard for you that I'm going to ask that you read, and it's labeled the ACE IFT model. It goes over this model in detail because this is a really important concept for you to understand, because I want you to be able to take on a client and recognize that maybe they're in phase 2 for resistance training, but they're only in phase 1 for cardiorespiratory training. And how do you help them get from phase 1 or phase 2 all the way up to phase 4? And if that's even a goal for them, because sometimes it's not a goal for them. They don't want to necessarily do performance training. So I'll really go over this briefly. Functional movement and resistance training phase 1. First concept is that before we do anything, before we add load, before we do performance movements, right, we need to make sure that they are stable and mobile. And that is the basic movement patterns and making sure their musculature is balanced and that they're able to do kind of some of those basic mobility and stability movement patterns. When we go into FMS, that's going to be a great example of testing someone to see what their stability and mobility is. Okay. Phase 2 goes into kind of basic movement training. So can they push, can they pull, can they do some of those basic movement patterns? Phase 3, can you do those movement patterns now with load? Okay, again, recognizing that once you get to phase 3, you still have stability and mobility, and you still are able to do those push-pull movement patterns, right? And then phase 4, once you're able to do phase 1 through phase 3, then you can go into more performance, and that's basically being able to do the same thing, but with time. Okay, so we're thinking about plyometric and power moves, okay? Cardiorespiratory training does the same thing. You start with your aerobic base. These are people who can really, they can't even perform 30 minutes of like moderate intensity exercise, right? So those are those individuals. Then eventually, once they have that aerobic base, you want to go up to aerobic efficiency, so being able to do it for a longer period of time. Once they have that, then they can move on to phase 3, which is that anaerobic endurance, right? And then phase 4, which is anaerobic and power. Okay, so I really, really encourage you, and I'm asking that you read that supplementary material because it's something that's going to be on your quizzes and your exams. It's also a really important concept for you to understand here in the fitness field. So now let's get into some goal setting. Why do we do it and when do we do it? You can do it at a number of different periods, right? You could do it the very first time you meet with them, but you can also do it after an assessment. You could do it during each session. You could do it as a reevaluation or reassessing. Okay. We expect that you are experts in SMART goals. So you should know what that acronym stands for, but more importantly, you should know how to implement SMART goals into your training. So as a reminder, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And when you set SMART goals, it's important for us to know the difference between action-oriented versus outcome-oriented. Outcome-oriented goals are typically what your client will say. I want to lose 10 pounds, okay? Then you have to reshift that and say, that's really wonderful, okay? Let's go ahead and figure out what action goals you can set to get to that outcome-oriented goal. So if that outcome-oriented goal is to lose 10 pounds, what actions or behaviors do you need to change, or goals do you need to set around those behavior changes to reach that outcome? It could be, for instance, for that 10-pound outcome-oriented goal, it could be, I'm going to get 150 minutes of moderate exercise every week. Okay, so that would be an action-oriented goal to reach that outcome-oriented goal. Okay, you need to prioritize and identify your client's needs versus their wants. And it depends on the individual. I think what we need to recognize is that oftentimes we see what they think as their needs as really only wants. But you also have to recognize that this is this individual's life and their perspective, right? So it might be really real to them. So we might perceive a want as really that's not important, right? It's not a need in your life, okay? But you have to recognize that these clients, it's real to them. Okay, so just recognizing their needs versus wants and what's reality, and then how you can work with their reality to kind of mold into kind of the rest of the world's reality. Okay, and then also knowing behavioral versus physiological goals. And again, we kind of talked about that with action-oriented versus outcome-oriented goals. So now let's look at a goal-setting example. I really like this chart because I think it's a good tool for you to be able to come back to, because a lot of times these are fitness goals that you're going to hear commonplace in our field. People want to decrease their body weight, right? Well, if they do, what is the realistic range? We hopefully know that's about 1 pound to 2 pounds per week. Okay, that's a common thing to know in our field. But what about body fat percentage? Well, we know on average, people can, on a healthy person, can decrease their body fat percentage by about 1% per month. Now, if you are working with people who are in more of a fitness, kind of higher end fitness level, like bodybuilders or powerlifters, you're going to see people who are going to want to drop body fat percentage a lot faster than 1% per month. So you have to recognize your client and their goals, but you also have to remember what is safe and what's been shown in science to be safe. And this is a good reminder to give your clients, okay? Increasing muscle mass, right? About 2 to 4 pounds per 8 weeks. That's what's realistic. So that will help people understand how slow of progress this is. If they want to gain strength and cardiovascular endurance, for strength, that can be anywhere from 5 to 50% versus cardiovascular endurance, which is 5 to 30%. And then decreasing resting heart rate, because some people will want to do this. On average, we see that people can decrease their resting heart rate with about 10 beats per minute every 10 weeks. Okay, so these are kind of some of those nice, realistic time range and time frames for people based on their fitness goals. So now let's think about all of these things. What goes into motivation and adherence, right? Well, readiness for change is really important to know. If you're familiar with the trans-theoretical model, that's a health behavior model that basically looks at the different stages of behavior change. And what's great is that you can recognize where your client is in that model, and then based on where they are, you can help them progress to where they want to be. So knowing someone's readiness to change is really important. In fact, I always ask my clients' readiness to change in my health screening. I have a 1 to 10 scale that I use, and they stop and they write that in there, and then I can assess that pre and post. It's important to know the law of possession, which basically says they need to take responsibility for what they're doing. Also recognizing that they're humans, right? And so their life has a lot of barriers and constraints that we may not recognize as trainers. So we might think, oh, it's easy, just do this, right? Take responsibility, just do this. But in order for you to have that connection with your client and for them to feel like you can empathize and understand them, it's equally as important for you to understand that their reality is true for them. Okay, so what essentially means is that while you might see it as simply as take responsibility for your actions, you also want to empathize that there are a lot of things out of their control as well. Okay, law of effort essentially says that exercise requires discipline, hard work, and delayed gratification. And that is an important concept for people to understand, because a lot of times the messages that they're getting from the fitness industry is that things are quick fix, and in reality they're not. Okay. Law of consistency basically says you just have to take it one step at a time, stay on track. Oftentimes people will say, Kelly, what's the one piece of recommendation that you'd give, right? For people who want to be healthy and active. And one of my number one things is staying consistent. Because if people do stay consistent and they don't give up on it, eventually they will see changes. Law of self-efficacy essentially says that they must believe in themselves and their goals. And self-efficacy is situation-specific confidence. Okay, so what we're trying to do with our clients is help them gain confidence in their belief in being able to be physically active, and their belief in being able to make health behavior changes. Okay, and then most importantly, being able to identify obstacles and solutions. One of the things I do with my clients is I say, okay, where do you want to be in 3 months? You can visualize that, kind of feel what that feels like, and between where that is and where you are now, what's in that gap? Let's identify some of those barriers and constraints, and let's problem solve ahead of time, so that you can kind of prevent a backwards end of those stages of change. Because what you don't want your client to do is go from one stage of change and actually go backwards. We want them to progress forward towards their goal. Okay. And adherence, the unfortunate thing is that we know almost 50% of people who start exercising will quit within a year. And there's many things that go into that, many reasons. It could be psychological, it could be social, it could be the environment that they're in, it could be behavioral or biological. So it's important that we don't make assumptions about this, and that we do try to problem solve in advance. And that's where identifying that gap, like I just said, is really important. It's also equally important to recognize who is more likely to drop out of a fitness program. So we know that people who are overweight or obese are more likely to drop out of a fitness program, probably because they don't feel welcome in our environments. If you think about the images that are out there, and we think about the stigma that very much exists when it comes to being overweight or obese, it makes sense why people may not feel comfortable in a health and fitness environment. People who have low self-motivation, people have anxiety about exercise, if they have kind of inconvenient to get there or to do, if it's too hard or too challenging for them, and if they don't have support, not just from their spouse or partner, but also from their social network, okay? Because that support piece is really important. And there's many strategies that you can use to, increase exercise program adherence. Recruiting support from programs, clients, and friends and family is really important. So that's why a lot of trainers will offer buddy training packages or small group training packages. The clients see it as a discount, right? Because they're being able to bring their friend and they're both paying less together. But you, if you think about it, by time are making more money because you're working with 2 individuals making more money in a less amount of time. So it's actually kind of a win-win in this regard. Okay, adding in some sort of games and making it fun and playful. Many adults like that and they want that. And so I know a lot of trainers who will incorporate that into their training, and they're very successful. But you also have to know your client, right? So you don't want to make it too kiddie, or else they'll kind of think it's a joke. Using progress charts. A lot of people like to see their progress, and that's why keeping journals or making sure that you're constantly reassessing them is really important. Establishing a reward system. Now this is good, and I just want to be sure that we're all clear on how intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation works. So using a reward system can be okay, right? But that's extrinsic rewards. So if you say, okay, if you meet your goal, you can buy a new workout outfit. That's great, but it's extrinsically motivated. And while that can help someone reach their goals, what we do know from behavior change theories is that in order for a behavior to become long-lasting and sustained, we need that motivation to come from within, and that's what we call intrinsic motivation. And so the importance is that while their motivation might start extrinsically, we need to figure out a way for that to become autonomous and become intrinsic motivation. So it's within, and they're doing it for themselves. Okay. Obviously, helping with us, like we can provide qualified exercise information, right? So the more qualified we are and the more education we have, the more likely they're going to stay with us. So that's really great. And then I want you to stop and think about technology, because a lot of people say that might be a strategy to help people stay with their exercise program, but I'm curious what you all think. So right now I'm going to pause, write down some reasons or reasons not of why you think technology can help with exercise program adherence. And then our next video will kind of pick up right with that.